All right, welcome to today's Explainer. We're stepping right into the classroom of military history today. We're looking at an absolute masterclass in how a nation takes the incredibly bitter, devastating sting of a military defeat, and in this case, we're talking about the 1962 Sino-Indian War up in the high Himalayas, and actually transforms that defeat into a rock-solid blueprint for modern defense. We're talking the highest altitudes, the harshest climates, and honestly, some of the most difficult tactical lessons a military has ever had to learn. We are going to see exactly how a modern military doctrine was quite literally forged in the freezing snow.
Now let's look at this timeline for a second. When a massive military disaster strikes, right, the natural human reaction is pure emotion. It's anger, it's finger-pointing, it's blame. But to survive the next conflict, you've got to strip all of that away completely. You have to take that past event, put it under a brutal microscope for some cold, hard analysis, and then use that raw data to build actual future strength. It's essentially an analytical machine, and today we're going to see exactly how that machine processes failure.
So this brings us to the ultimate question, doesn't it? Why study military history at all? I mean, it's not just to memorize dates or draw lines on a map. We study it because dissecting old battles and strategic failures literally dictates our modern survival. As the source material makes incredibly clear, spending on defense and genuinely preparing for war is basically like taking out an insurance policy. A military student, or honestly anyone who cares about national security, absolutely needs to understand the why behind a defeat to guarantee, and I mean guarantee, that it never happens again.
Okay, here is our syllabus for today's chalkboard breakdown. We'll be covering strategy and national interest, decisions and intelligence, applying force multipliers, tactics in mountain warfare, the human dimension, and finally, building future preparedness. Let's get into it.
Section 1. Strategy and national interest. Aligning goals.
Now, looking at the strategic pyramid here, the big takeaway from 1962 was that without aligning your actual on-the-ground military capability to your high-level national interest, any grand strategy is just inevitably going to collapse. Think about it. If diplomatic means fail, you actually need the necessary forces raised and ready to go. Back in 1962, the grand strategy simply did not match the physical capability they had on the ground. It was a complete mismatch.
Moving right along, Section 2. Decisions and intelligence. Flawed processing.
This contrast right here is absolutely crucial. The disastrous forward policy of 1962, it was entirely assumption-based. The political leadership just assumed, hoped really, that the Chinese would not use force against Indian troops who were establishing new posts. Compare that disastrous assumption to the absolute necessity of evidence-based military realism. That relies on actual, verified troop movements and proven capabilities. The gap between what they perceived was going to happen and the reality on the ground was just staggering.
Which brings us to the intelligence cycle. You can think of it like a mechanical loop. Collect, analyze, share, and act. But here's the catch. A failure in just one of these steps completely paralyzes a military. In 1962, tactical intelligence was sort of haphazardly collected and really badly processed. And the worst part, even when vital intel about enemy buildups was gathered, it wasn't shared with the field commanders. It created this devastating lack of coordination right when they needed it most.
Section 3. Applying force multipliers. Amplifying combat power.
So in 1962, there were some incredibly severe asymmetries in these force multipliers. Take air power, for example. The Indian Air Force was left completely unused for offensive support because of faulty intelligence, which tragically left the infantry on the ground with zero cover. Meanwhile, on the other side, vastly superior Chinese border infrastructure handed their military a decisive advantage to rapidly move troops and heavy artillery. Ignoring your force multipliers is literally like fighting with one hand tied behind your back.
Okay, Section 4. Tactics in mountain warfare. Himalayan warfare.
We really need to talk about the extreme friction of mountain combat because it requires massive physical exertion. We're talking extreme cold, brutal, rugged terrain, and the absolute logistical nightmare of just trying to supply your troops. These things dictate the battle. In '62, troops from the plains were rushed into high-altitude zones without proper acclimatization, some even without proper winter clothing. I mean, the climate itself can destroy an unprepared army before the enemy even fires a single shot.
And when you violate the fundamental principles of war in that kind of environment, it leads to rapid, total tactical collapses. For instance, Indian defenses were poorly sited. They lacked adequate security, which left them highly visible to the enemy. Their forces were spread way too thin. Meanwhile, the adversary was using textbook doctrines. They were concentrating overwhelming numbers and actively exploiting gaps to achieve complete and total surprise.
Section 5. The human dimension. The ultimate factor.
John F. Kennedy actually once said, "Victory has many fathers. Defeat is an orphan." And wow, is that true? It is incredibly easy to just point fingers and assign blame after a major defeat. But true, honest analysis requires us to step back and objectively study the immense pressures, the incredibly confusing intelligence, and the genuinely terrible conditions that those leaders and soldiers actually faced on the ground, entirely free from the lens of blame.
Because true military preparedness requires immense moral courage. Take General Thorett, for example. Here's a commander who was actually willing to sacrifice his own career rather than implement a flawed forward policy that went against his conscience. Now that is real leadership. When you combine that kind of moral courage with the sheer physical endurance needed to survive extreme hardships, that is exactly how you build the foundation of unshakable morale.
Which leads us into our final part, Section 6, Building Future Preparedness, Forging Defenses.
Here's the silver lining. The painful failures of 1962 actually birthed elite specialized institutions. Because the troops lacked proper training back then, the High Altitude Warfare School, or HAWS, was massively expanded into the world-class institution it is today. Because tactical intelligence failed so terribly, specialized local scout battalions known as the Sons of the Soil were raised to guarantee unparalleled local knowledge. They took the past and directly used it to engineer future readiness.
And we'll leave it here. As history constantly reminds us, nature abhors a vacuum. A lack of military strength is always going to be a temptation for aggressive neighbors. Today, we've seen how a nation can pivot from an absolute disaster to a profound tactical evolution. But I'll leave you with this ultimate question to ponder. Are modern nations truly learning from the harsh realities of their past, or are they simply just waiting to repeat them? Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer.